And I welcome the opportunity to speak on this bill, and I'm glad the Minister is here, because in your speech you acknowledged that different members inside the House and people outside the House would have different viewpoints, and I certainly have a very different viewpoint on this bill. And let me also say that I have the greatest respect for the Gardaí on the ground. Let me just preface that. Many's the time I've had little respect for the management, as with all institutions. And indeed, that wasn't helped by my introduction to the Dáil in February 16, February, March, where the first document I read was the O'Higgins report in relation to Sergeant McCabe. And I don't think we can mention that man's name often enough with respect and with gratitude for what he did. So that was my introduction. I've read many reports after that from various High Court judges and various people in relation to Garda behaviour. And when I talk about Garda behaviour, I talk about it from the top down. I, in my role as a TD or a mother, the first to ring the guards in the expectation that they will come and that I can trust them and tell them what's happening. So I'm talking here about what has happened with Gardaí. You remember the Morris Tribunal? You might remember the price of that and the foolishness of thinking that that was located to one geographical area in Donegal. I mean, had anybody at the time said, oh God, let's look at this, we might have preempted what subsequently happened with Sergeant McCabe. But we didn't, of course, do that. And then there was the collusion between the Gardaí and the Northern Ireland Police Force. Remember that? The Smithick Tribunal, any amount of examples. So forgive me if I come from a very sceptical position. I do so adopt that same position in relation to myself as a TD and this institution. I constantly question myself and all institutions, because they end up protecting themselves and they do not end up serving the people that they're there to serve, including councils and local authorities that have taken on the mantle of corporatisation. We did have councils that served. So I make my comments in that. Institutions are always in danger of serving themselves and becoming more important than the people they're there to serve. So in that context, this Garda, very innocuous title, Garda Síochána Bill, and then in commas, brackets, Recording Devices Bill. And you gave a speech that failed utterly to tease out the balance that must be made between the fundamental right to privacy, which I'm going to come back to, and then the infringement or the intrusion or the invasion on that right for the common good, for public safety. But that's a very delicate teasing out. Top of the list has to be the fundamental right to privacy. And we take that away at our peril. And so when we do take it away, we do it in a way that's measured, that's necessary, that's proportionate, and that's only for a certain length of time. Now, those safeguards are not here at all for me to see, and I've done my best, and I welcome some of the things. I welcome the mandatory human rights assessment, and I welcome that there's an acknowledgement that there must be a data processing assessment and so on. I do welcome those things in the bill. What I don't see, and forgive me again for strain, but it's all relevant. When we were discussing the mother and baby home bill in the report stage yesterday, one of the great lacking things in the title was putting it in context, which is what various groups asked for. The Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, the various organisations on the ground. Enshrine in the title the fundamental principles of human rights, and then the legislation derives from that. That wasn't done. It certainly has not been done here. The title is minimalist, and it underestimates what we're doing. And I try to stay away from my own opinion, even though I'm on record for telling you I'm very sceptical, and I do my best to read the documents of the experts that went before the Joint Policing Committee, and I welcome that report, and I welcome the work that went into the pre-legislative scrutiny. I'm often standing here criticising that it hadn't happened. It did happen, and I want to acknowledge that. But this piece of legislation, in the words of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, They have concerns about this bill, which proposes to significantly expand the ability of Gardaí, including civilian and reserve Gardaí, to monitor people's behaviour in public spaces. This will impact people's right to privacy, data protection, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and engage protections against non-discrimination. Now, I don't think we can disagree with what's been set out here, maybe the extent to which it's infringing on those rights, but I think you would accept, Minister, that it is infringing. Now, that has been acknowledged, the right to privacy. Let me just go through it because I think it's important because it's not set out anywhere. The right to privacy is protected by Bunreacht na hÉireann, the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights. Of course it may be limited, and I'm sure colleagues to the right, more learned than I, are going to talk about that, hopefully. But the right to privacy is protected in all of these legal instruments. The Data Protection Act, which is fundamental, 2018, gives effect to the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR that we're all semi-familiar with, and the Law Enforcement Directive. Parts 5 and 6 of that 18 Act concerns the processing of personal data by data controllers who are competent for their role. And then, in general terms, and I'm going to come back to data processing and their role, because local authorities and guards have utterly failed to comply with their obligations in the operation of CCTV cameras. That's not my opinion, that's the data controller's opinion, who I understand the office is still continuing with its investigations in relation to Garda stations and 31 local authorities. So in general terms, Article 5 of the GDPR sets out key principles which are central to data protection, namely lawfulness, fairness, transparency, purpose limitation, so we don't have creep. If there's a reason and a purpose, set it out clearly. Data minimization, accuracy, storage limitation, integrity, confidentiality, and accountability. And then if I go to, and I want to thank the Digest once again for setting this out for us, as I want to thank the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and all of the other organisations who have made submissions and helped us. The European Convention on Human Rights and the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights allow for an encroachment, Minister, upon the right to privacy where it is necessary and proportionate to do so. The use of technology for law enforcement purposes gives rise to such an infringement on the individual's right to privacy and data protection. So it has to be done in a proportionate and necessary way. To ensure that such infringements are necessary and proportionate, this body recommends a law enforcement measure, if and when assessed to be necessary, should then be analysed according to whether it would be more appropriate if it were only limited to serious crime. And they go on to expand on that. With respect to video surveillance, which is an integral part of this in all its forms, including drones, with respect to video surveillance, the EDPS states such systems should not be installed if they are not effective in achieving their purposes. For example, if they merely provide the illusions of greater security. So this word, the illusions of greater security. In all my political career, I've heard certain segments of people on the ground and councillors crying out for more CCTV cameras. I remember doing a lot of research at the time, or gathering up the research papers, and there was absolutely no evidence to justify the installation of CCTV cameras in the manner that they were being installed. Fast forward 23 now, so for 22 years later, and the evidence in relation to what we're putting through here, at the very least, is inconclusive. So when you talk about evidence, as you did this morning when you were interviewed, the evidence, I noticed that there was a complete failure to follow up on what that evidence is, because I would love to see it. Because I have read all of those documents, and the evidence in relation to the surveillance that we're now carrying out is at best contradictory and inconclusive. And so these organisations have asked us to be very careful in what we're doing. And the police and authority are there too. And there are sort of graded opinions on what they're find of concern, let me say. There are graded, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties being the most outspoken in relation to their concerns. But the police and authority had great concerns, although they saw some advantage, but it depended on how it was managed, how it was protected, and the oversight. And so I think proceeding down this, let me just deal with and I see the chair is here of the committee, and I've already thanked the chair for their work and their detailed scrutiny of the bill. And we have 15 recommendations from that committee, having looked at listened to all of these submissions. They recommended that the codes of practices covering Head 2 ensure that information and data collected by body-worn cameras and CCTV devices will not use facial recognition technology. That's recommendation number 1, and will not be used to racially profile members of the public. They go on, I leave it to the chairperson to go through, but what jumps out at me is that they recommended a pilot scheme to try the use of recording devices and body-worn cameras and so on. Specifically to the bill itself, the operation of recording devices by the guards, part 2. This part doesn't include CCTV or automatic number plate recognition. It includes the use of a device that's remotely controlled and can be attached to an animal. Its use, it says, must be necessary and proportionate in line with an applicable code of practice. There are no codes of practice to be seen anywhere. I would have thought we would have seen those. I read some explanation that they can't have a code of practice because of procurement difficulties, and difficulties is the wrong word, the complexity of procurement, and that has to be sorted out first to see what's appropriate. I welcome the fact that if we're going to go with this, that they have to be overt, although I am concerned where practical is put in there. Part 3 looks at the use of automatic number plate recognition. Again, it must be proportionate. There are data sharing agreements. I'm very concerned about focused monitoring of a particular vehicle for up to 3 months, and the way that can be authorised without district court, and then the district court in camera. I understand that this was not discussed at pre-legislative scrutiny, but again, that can be corrected. The statutory basis for recording phone calls to and from the Garda station. This follows on from the Fennelly Commission, of course, where there was no statutory basis up to now. So guards operating illegally or with no legal status. Monitoring, taping people's phone call conversations. Then we have the changing to the legal framework for authorisation and installation of cameras. And this is particularly interesting for me, coming from 17 years at local authority. Now, under statute, only Garda personnel and local authorities will be authorised to operate such schemes. Why is that, Minister? Because the Data Protection Commissioner, and I understand subject to your correction, is still carrying out investigations, but has previously investigated the use of CCT for law enforcement purposes and found several infringements. And so this is seeking to correct that situation. However, my difficulty is they are still carrying out their investigations, and they're the most serious infringements without any contract between the local authority, any written agreement between the local authority and the guards, or between a third-party operator, and many other infringements. And we're not waiting for that to be completed. What I have read is of serious concern to me. I was part of a local authority that saw the operation of those CCTV cameras without without any clarity, without any legal basis, and the legal basis that was there was infringed by both the Gardaí and the local authority personnel. That's of serious concern to me. Then we have part 6, which the power for a member of the Gardaí to process live feeds of third-party CCTV. Again, I think the listeners need to know that we're now given power to the guards to access, in whatever manner is appropriate, remotely or otherwise, CCTV cameras in somewhere else outside of Garda, operated by a third party. And we're going to do that without any judicial authorisation in certain situations. In other situations, there will be judicial authorisation, and then it can go on for quite some time. I have huge difficulties with that. I welcomed already the mandatory human rights assessment. I'm nearing the end of my time, so I'm going to quote and stick to organisations. The European Convention on Human Rights stated that the use of surveillance technology should be particularly precise, considering their invasiveness and the potential for the sophistication in technology to increase over time. The tests of necessity and appropriateness appear 14 times in the bill. The staff in my office outlined this, the staff in the library services outlined this. 14 times, however, there's no criteria in the bill which defines how this test will be made. As mentioned already, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties talks about the vast expansion of the surveillance powers of the guards without sufficient evidence that these developments are necessary in an Irish context and under our international obligations, proportionate to the risk they pose to a range of rights. The policing authority, which is not known to be very radical, and it has done great work during COVID, and I read all of their reports, expressed concerns that the use of recording devices such as drones, there's concern that they would become normalised, and recommended that the legislation sets out the principle, the legislation, not regulation, the legislation, the principles and standards of accountability and oversight. And of course, we have all the other worries about profiling and about bias, which is inbuilt into the technology, as I understand it, over policing in certain areas, and generally a whole range of concerns, Minister, that I would have thought should have been teased out in your speech. Because while we want to protect the guards, it must be done within a context of human rights, in a limited way, for a limited purpose, proportionate and necessary. That is not what's happening here. That's not what the Irish Council for Civil Liberties think is happening here. They tell us that they will go on to look at facial recognition technology that was never discussed, and yet yourself and the Minister who's out says you're going to introduce an amendment. So you've deprived the TDs of the process of pre-legislative scrutiny on that. It's going to come forward as an amendment. The Irish Council for Civil Liberties are concerned that the bill will enable Gardaí to routinely collect, retain, store and search vast amounts of public data, of personal data of members of the public. They believe that facial recognition technology has no place in Irish policing, and they go on to clarify why that is. The live feed they have great concerns about, and I share those concerns in relation to the Gardaí accessing third-party video or CCTV footage with or without district court judge approval, depending on the situation. So I'll finish by saying I think this legislation is wrong. I believe the guards need protection. I believe there could be a place for cameras, depending on how they're monitored, how the data is collected, who uses them, when are they used, when are they switched off. I see something in your speech here and in various comments about domestic violence, and I must say I'm a little cynical in relation to that, as someone who has repeatedly stood up here about domestic violence and gender-based violence and all of the lacking in that area. And suddenly body-worn cameras are going to be a great asset when Garda attends a domestic incident. A little cynical now in relation to the use of it that way, and you might clarify, was that discussed with Women's Aid and all of the other organisations that have been in touch with us? Garmag.